Hi, my name is Mike Snow and I'm doing another history book review here, this time of The Scramble for Africa, White Man's Conquest of the Dark Continent by Thomas Pakenham. This is one of the best history books I've ever read, probably the best single history book I've read about Africa. It is incredibly interesting, incredibly exciting, it's written wonderfully, and this is an absolute must-read for understanding the 19th century of Europe or Africa, because Africa was such a central part of the latter half of the 19th century for Europe, because they colonized the whole darn thing. The story covers 1876 to 1912, the height of the scramble for Africa, when the European states began to irrationally carve up the continent between themselves. And that's the height and the thrust of the idea of the scramble for Africa as distinguished from earlier colonial eras, because there was always some sort of logic or rationality to why they wanted to take over areas, because I think they had a clearer grasp of the difficulties that involved, which were so much greater in the pre-late industrial era. But in the Scramble for Africa, it really became an almost manic and ridiculous chase towards grabbing and gobbling up as much territory as possible, whether that territory was really worthwhile or not. There were fights in Europe, threats of war, that a couple of nations at a couple of different points in this book could have gone to war over seemingly ridiculous issues over not very valuable land in Africa. And I really like how the book goes over the moods that the European public and government went in terms of colonies, because nowadays, after we realize that Europe colonized virtually the entire African continent with a couple of tiny exceptions and held it for decades, around a century or so in most places, we tend to think of it in those terms, but when you go back and actually see it unfolding, it becomes clearer that people's moods and desires to colonize were variable. And at some points they thought it was absolutely ridiculous and absolutely stupid and they never wanted to do it. They would ridicule people who wanted to colonize, but then just a couple of years later, because this was the era of mass democracy finally coming out, the 1870 to 1914 was when all the laws were passed in various countries, allowing more and more people to vote. Suddenly every male could vote. And it goes over a lot of the reasons for people wanting, both in government and in the general populace, to take over these countries. And some were very rational, like they had resources that they wanted, and some were, there was some sort of strategic purpose for taking over this area for land or sea routes to other colonies or other places, or trade routes. And some were distinctly irrational, or maybe not irrational, but more pie-in-the-sky spiritualism, like trying to save people from slavery, or trying to convert everyone from paganism or Islam to Christianity, or something like that. Or maybe it was just that a noble hero from their country, or a person they perceived to be a noble hero, like Colonel Gordon or something like that, someone like that, had been killed or tortured in that country. And they wanted to avenge the death of their hero. Sometimes it was pure rivalry. So much of the book is just, we find out that countries were just playing with the entire continent, sort of wrangling with one another. And that's one of the absolute highlights of the book, is that it doesn't just spend all of its time in Africa, it spends a long time going into in-depth discussions of the governments of Europe, especially in Britain, France, and Germany, especially in Britain. And that's some of the best stuff we have in the book. We get an intimate look of the British government of the time. And we get to see all the major players like Disraeli and Gladstone, and all of the various prime ministers and people in the Foreign Office and the Colonial Office and the India Office, and all of the wrangling and all of the reasons and all of the people who are pro-colonization and against it, and the fights that they had and the reasons they went to war and took things over, and how idealism clashed so often with materialism. It's really fascinating reading about it, and especially reading about Bismarck and his reasons for getting a colony, and the desire for Italy, sort of the the little guy in the pack of European countries trying to prove itself as a power, taking over other countries in Africa, or trying and failing, as we discover as they tried to do in Ethiopia, and France trying to recover some of her martial honor after being defeated in 1870 by fighting wars in Northwest and Central Africa. And that's especially important, it's very timely, because France is sending troops into West Africa right now to, again, they've been doing this for over a century now, and would have seemed, I think, a couple of months ago as fairly obscure history, the history of France's colonies in West Africa is suddenly very important and very au courant because of what's going on in West Africa right now, because the French are going in there and invading, and we get to find out why and what their cultural link is to this area in their former colonies. It also does a great job of setting the mood in Africa. It talks about the deep, dark, scary jungles and the vast, endless stretches of desert and all of the lands in between, and how the explorers went from one side of the continent to the other, and the heroic journeys that they went on to try to get from one area to another. I don't mean heroic in a good way, I just mean heroic in an enormous struggle, because some of the explorers were not very good. The book does a magnificent job of balancing between various stories. It tells the stories of the explorers and intercuts them with the stories of the governments, sending soldiers, but also in the companies and the private interests going in here, and some of the natives fighting back against them, and it has this whirling, sweeping, panoramic view of an entire continent in these decades. And the fact that he's able to blend this all together so brilliantly is absolutely wonderful. And of course, in the background of all of this is the sinister and incredibly villainous King Leopold II, the King of the Belgians, the Roi de Belgique, who is mercilessly and admittedly very cleverly playing and using all of the European countries against each other in order to commit one of the greatest barbarities of the 19th century, if not the greatest, the rape of the Congo. And it does a magnificent job showing the ridiculous power struggles between Britain and France, and why Leopold was able to do this, this petty king of a small country, how he was able to obtain this gigantic area of land, and how much it had to do with the rivalries and irrational fears of the Europeans between each other, especially between Britain, France, and Germany. The book also handles a really tough problem in history brilliantly. One of the problems in history is that sometimes it's hard for people that are not history lovers like myself to get involved and invested in stories that were the talk of the day, the breaking news headlines of the time, like the Siege of Khartoum and Gordon's death, or the discovery of Livingstone, and bring them to life for a new generation. And he's able to really do that well, especially with Fashoda, one of these moments that is almost forgotten today, but it was one of the enormous, important moments in Anglo-French history, where they almost went to war over this tiny little miserable scrap of desert in the Sudan, and how they managed to avoid it. He does a great job of making things exciting. It really gets exciting and interesting, and feels it's reading like an adventure novel when he talks about the Ivory War in the Congo, and how these Belgian explorers and traders are working with armies of cannibals to fight Arab slave raiders, and both sides are fighting with spears and matchlocks, and how they're trying to outwit one another, and people are being eaten and killed, and this incredible barbarity and savagery and violence, and it really becomes exciting, like a historical adventure novel, and I think that's very well done. It's written in an elegant, well-spoken, but thoroughly readable style. It also uses a lot of Gallicisms, and being a Francophile, I love that. It adds a real touch of class to this book that I always like to see, and it was an absolute pleasure to read all of these pages. I think there's around 700 pages in the book, and they were all exciting and all interesting. And I've read it several times now. I've had it for a couple years. It's an incredible book. It goes through all of the different people and places and locations in Africa, and you couldn't get a better overview of the time period in this book. Some minor bad points about the book is, one of them is that the book really presumes that you have a general knowledge of European history and to some degree of African history of the time. It does not waste any time going into detail of what's going on that the writer assumes you know. So that wasn't really a problem for me, but I think for some people, especially if you're not a huge history buff, and we're not really familiar with 19th century history, late Victorian, late industrial era history, you might want to just brush up on it, look at some of the general historical events in Europe at the time to get a background for why the European powers were acting this way, and get to know a few of the names, because it's going to drop a lot of names of people in government in Europe that you're going to have to know and you're going to have to learn probably beforehand to get a good feel of what's going on. Also, I think I would have liked a little bit more background about the pre-Stanley explorers. It doesn't really go into much detail about people like Speke and Burton, especially after the beginning of the book where it kind of stops mentioning them. I can't blame the book for that, though, because then it would have made this already very long, dense book much longer and much more complicated. So it's not really a fault of the book. It's really my fault of being ignorant of that time period. But this book has made me interested in it, and I hope to read more about it. It also does a great job contrasting the two most important explorers of this era in the late 1870s and afterwards, which is Henry Morton Stanley and Pierre de Brauza. Henry Morton Stanley was very much a rough, crude, mean, tough guy who is described as a knuckle duster to de Brauza's rapier in the book, which I think was a brilliant way to describe it. Stanley is a very rough and ready, very mean, very military-oriented type explorer who does some very, very nasty things to Africans, kills quite a few of them, keeps many of them in chains if they disobey him, robs African villages, kills and shoots people, as the book describes, almost as if they were monkeys at times, and caused a scandal in Europe for his actions. So to scandalize people with the level of racism present in late Victorian London, that takes something, it really does. And it shows de Brauza, who is not as famous as he deserved. People know Stanley's name, even people who have no idea about history at all. They know Stanley because of the Dr. Livingstone, I presume, line, but they don't know de Brauza, who was a much kinder, gentler explorer, who only once in his many years of exploring actually used violence, and that was only to defend himself. And he claimed it was only to defend himself against someone who had been made violent and cruel towards Europeans by Stanley's brutalization of Africans. But on the whole, de Brauza was a much more patient, much more kind explorer who was willing to talk to people, to spend time bartering and trading and genuinely becoming friends with Africans and trying to work with them rather than trying to abuse them. And it's really heartbreaking at the end of the book when we find out that de Brauza's explorations, even though they were much kinder and much gentler, had been used by the government to just as brutal a purpose in the French Congo as they had in the Belgian Congo. It's a really sad, exciting, tragic story that needs to be told. This needs to be a movie. I'd love to write it. You know, sort of showing Stanley and de Brauza and their various adventures in Africa at the time and contrasting them and seeing how they did things so much differently and showing their lives. You know, de Brauza a much kinder, friendlier person. Stanley a much more reserved, almost mean, taciturn person. Even with Europeans. So all in all, if you're interested in this time period, this is the book to get. It is absolutely fascinating, absolutely exciting. It really is great. It is very well done, very well written. The descriptions of the characters are great. And it also has the thrilling, exciting feel in many areas of a historical adventure novel set in Africa during the colonial times, except that this actually happened. And I couldn't recommend this book more if you're interested in the time period. I really, really think you should read this book if you're interested at all in Africa or Europe in the late 19th century.